Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, I don't think have I got audio? 1 2 1 2. I think so. Just not showing it. 1 2 1 2. Just let me know if you can hear me okay, guys, because it's not showing me that I've got audio from here. Let me just go to live chat, say hi everyone. If you're there, can you just let me know, make sure you have got audio, because I'm not seeing it on my side, so just make sure you actually are seeing it. Let me just switch to this camera just to see. 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 4. Not sure, that one seems to be working. Anyway, if you are watching, just say hi. Make sure you can actually hear me. I think you can now. I'm going to give a discussion today. I've had a lot of people asking me about whether you should buy the A7R III or the A9, or even whether you should have both. So I'm going to talk to you about that today from my experience. Jim's saying, yeah, you can hear me, so that's great. I'm going to give you sort of my opinion, and I'm going to go through the specs of what each camera is going to offer you. And then I'll sort of talk about what I believe each camera is for, because they are different in each case. Let me just change something here. Remember, I actually said just recently that there's no perfect camera at all at this stage with any manufacturer, and this is the same thing with this release as well. And I also said that with even the A9. There's no perfect camera that has been released yet. For me personally, though, I have to be honest, I think the A9 for me personally is the best camera that I've ever used for my purpose. But I will talk about that as we go on a little bit in this discussion, because I'd like to talk to you about how that works as well. I'm also lucky too that I also have the A7R II as well, so I do have that camera. And I think if I didn't have the A7R II, I would definitely, without a doubt, be buying the A7R III, and that's for sure. At this stage though, I'm probably not going to, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end when we have summary, and we can also have a bit of a question time as well, where we can go through that too, all of us together. So I thought I'd mention some of the things that are discussed in the text with these cameras, the specifications and how they both fit into one another, because I've seen a number of articles on YouTube particularly, and I've also had a lot of people send me questions. Does this make the A9 obsolete? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today in the specifications and how it fits with my workflow. Now remember, no one has the same workflow as anyone else, so everyone is different, and I'm just going to give you my opinion about where these cameras fit into my workflow, and whether, you know, I will be upgrading or what I think about the whole new A7R III, etc. So I thought I'd go with you that together today. Obviously, if you're not viewing live, you can ask questions down below. I will give some question time at the end, and I will go back to those questions for you as well as we go through these. So what we're going to do, I'm actually just going to switch over to, we'll start looking at the A9 first. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through the A9 specs, then we'll go through the A7R specs, and then I'll talk about where each camera will fit in with basically your workflow, or how they would fit in with my workflow. I can't talk about your workflow, obviously, but I can talk about how they fit in to my workflow, and we'll discuss that sort of with questions and everything at the end too. So let's switch over and we'll have a look at this. So I'm going to start with the A9, and basically I've just listed some of the main things from the specs site. And we're going to do anything that's the same. I've just said basically I'll say it's the same. So let's have a look at the A9. So the Sony A9 and the A7R II both have the same battery now, which is an amazing thing in itself. That battery is incredible. I shot a wedding on the weekend, and I shot over 1,000 images, and I only had to change over to that battery right at the end of the day in the reception, and I was using the grip, so it didn't matter. It just switched onto the second battery. But it actually only switched over to that second battery at the end of the day. So I'd use that battery for the whole day. So I think Sony have actually really underestimated how many shots you can take with that battery. Like I said, I think it was just over 1,000 images. I did a dance shoot also on the weekend, and I think I shot 2,500 images on that one, but that was more run and gun stuff where I was firing off multiple images together, whereas the wedding one was a lot slower, and I did take my time shooting the wedding that I did. But clearly the battery is going to be the same now for both cameras, so that's a real game changer for both of these cameras. So no longer can people say the Sony batteries are no good. So we'll put down at this stage that the battery basically is just the same. Same as the 2 card slots. Keep firing your questions away too, guys, because I will come back to your questions. Same as the 2 card slots. They both have the same card slots. One's the faster one, the other second card slot is the slower one. I'm not sure why they do that, but anyway, that's there. But at least we do have the 2 card slots in both cameras. So let's talk about now some of the differences. So the Sony A9 has, it is all phase detect. Well, they do have some contrast, but the phase detect, which is the thing that really matters if you're talking about using very fast, acquiring focus very, very quickly, the A9 has 693 phase detect focus points, and that covers 93% of the viewfinder. Now, you might be saying, well, if I scroll down and we look at the A7R II, the A7R II has 399, and that only covers 68%, so there's a massive difference. The A7R II, though, does have a lot more contrast detection points, but they're nowhere near as fast as using phase detection. So clearly, if you're dealing with automatic focus here, the A9 is superior to what the A7R II is going to give you. Now, when I shot the dance recital on the weekend, I was using my A9 in electronic shutter. The beauty with that camera is as soon as something appears into the frame, it immediately locks on focus. So when the girls were running out doing their jumps, it was the only way, this is the only camera I've ever been able to capture them from the whole way from when they entered till they exited. And that was because of the 693 points and that 93% coverage in that camera. So again, this is why I'm saying these cameras are both different. And I'll talk about the advantages with the A7R II because that has some big advantages over the A9 as well. But I'm just giving you the A9 advantages at this stage. So if you're dealing with acquiring focus very, very quickly and having it follow over the whole LCD, the A9 is way ahead of what the A7R III will give you. The other thing too is it will also work with eye detect as well, whereas the eye detect will work over 93% of the frame, so almost 100% of it. It'll follow completely over the whole frame, whereas if you're using the A7R III, it will lose that eye when it moves outside of that 3% or whatever it is for that focus point. So there is a difference in there. So the focus is still going to be much better on the A9 than it will be on the A7R III. They may both acquire basically almost as quick when they're inside those focused area points, but Sony have even admitted in all of their literature that the Sony A9 is still faster than what the A7R III is. Now let's talk about the buffer. So there's 240 raw pictures in the buffer. Now obviously that can also be because of you're dealing with half of the file size of what the A7R III is. So you've got 240 raw pics in the buffer, whereas the A7R III has 76 raw pictures. Now you might be saying I'll never use that, but it is possible if you're doing sports, for instance, that you would use that shutter to get an immediate or to so you don't miss a moment, and that can be important as well. And this is why I'm still saying that the A9 is definitely more a sports camera or even a wedding camera than what the A7R III is, but we'll talk about that as we go down a little bit further. It's got a stack sensor, which is a much newer design. Remember, the A7R III is basically the same sensor as the A7R II. And there was an interesting article I read the other day talking about the dynamic range was very similar to the A7R II. I think you're going to find it's definitely going to be better. But the stack sensor is much newer, and it's much newer technology than what they have in the A7R III. There's no way Sony we're going to give you that same sensor in the A7R III because then obviously no one will buy the A9. So definitely it's a faster sensor. That gives you the 20 frames per second that you get with that if you're using electronic shutter as against a mechanical shutter which is only 5. So the A7R III definitely has an advantage if you're dealing with mechanical shutter, but we'll talk about that more when we go into the A7R III advantages. But the 20 frames per second is incredible if you need that. I showed in my last discussion where a bride and groom were throwing their keys that they had to locks into a lake, and the only reason why I got that was because I was shooting at 20 frames per second. If I had 10, I don't think I would have got that. I only got it in 1 frame. And this is what I'm saying with the difference between, say, having 20 frames per second and having 10 can make a difference in some scenarios. So some people say you'll never need 20, but I've already used that and it is an advantage. I very rarely use it, but it is there. But if you were a sports photographer, for instance, you would be using that 20 frames per second often, I would think, to get the shots that you actually needed. The other thing is too, it has 0 blackout. The A7R III doesn't have 0 blackout. I think it does up to 7 frames per second, but when you're dealing with anything over that, it does have a slight delay, and that can be a difference of tracking something that's moving. For instance, if you wanted to track a bird or something like that, that could be the difference of being able to track that that or not. Or even if I was, like I said, shooting that dancers that were coming over on the weekend, it could be a difference if you lose that blackout. A big advantage for me is the, I'm just going to take that one out of there. A big advantage for me, and I've used this often, is this 1/32,000th of a second electronic shutter speed. That gives me the ability to shoot with, say, a 1.4 lens wide open on a sunny day. And that for me is a game changer for me. Being able to shoot a bride wide open without using an ND filter and doing things like that, wide open in bright sunlight and having that out of depth of field look is beautiful. And I use that now all the time, and honestly that I could never lose that now once I've started using it. It's such an advantage being able to go over 1/8,000th of a second. It's just amazing. I've found that I very rarely use my electronic mechanical shutter on the A9. Very rarely. The only time I'll use it is when I'm using flash. If I'm not using flash, I'm going to be using the electronic shutter. And having that ability to go to 1/32,000th of a second is a huge advantage. And like I said, I can't underestimate that. It's a game changer for me. There's almost no rolling shutter at all. I haven't seen any rolling shutter at all on the A9. Even in video, it's incredible. Even in video, there's no difference in the video that I can see between using Super 35 mode or APS-C mode and full frame mode when you're shooting video. Whereas they're saying on the A7R III you have to use APS-C mode or Super 35 mode to get the best quality. The A9, for some reason, well, it must be the sensor. The A9, there's no difference between using that crop mode and full frame. So it probably is still the only full frame Sony camera that you can use that you do get the full advantage of using it in full frame mode when you're shooting video. But it's missing a lot of the other features. That's why the Sony A7R III is a much better video camera, but we'll talk about that in the A7R III advantages shortly. Very little banding. I haven't seen any banding yet, and I've been using this in really challenging light, my A9. I haven't had any banding to talk about at all, so that's been one really good thing with that. I can't talk about the A7R III because it's not released yet, but I do notice that they're saying in the literature that you can get rolling shutter, and it's also mentioned about the banding. But I noticed the A7R III does have a setting in it that will try and gain your exposure at the brightest part of the flashing light. So that may eliminate it. So we'll have to wait and see when that's released and we get proper reviews of the camera coming out. But the A9 is outstanding in rolling shutter. Like I said, I haven't had any, and even in these concerts that I've been doing with all of this lighting going on, weddings with incredibly challenging lighting, I've had no banding at all. So it's got 13 stops of dynamic range, which is ample for what I need. If I do need it to go further, that's where I'll be using my A7 II, and clearly the A7R III has more dynamic range, so that is a big advantage with the A7R III as well. So let's scroll down now and look at the A7R III. So we've got the same battery, obviously, as the A9. We've got 2 card slots. We talked about the phase detection, that it's got 399 and 68% of the viewfinder, so it's not as good as what the A9 is giving you, and the raw pics in the buffer is not as good, but I don't think you'd ever be using this camera to be shooting that many raw files. It's a lot different than what you would be using, say, for the A9. What's that new improved? I just put this together a second ago. It's probably going to be... yeah, so it basically... Basically, it's saying it's 399, yeah, and 68% of the coverage, 76% raw pics in the buffer, which is incredible when you think about the file size that this A7R is using. It's amazing that they can get that working, and you can even view the images on the back. as well. So they've really upped the buffer in this camera, which is great. So it's probably like the difference of going from the A6300 to the A6500, and I love that aspect of the A6500A. The buffer is so much better, and you can look at the images while it's, you've just stopped shooting. Whereas the A7R II can be frustrating while you're waiting to preview an image sometimes. It can get really frustrating. So it's got the same sensor as the A7R II, but it's new and improved. Processing, so it's got a better processor, and that's how you've got the extra stop of dynamic range. We'll have to see how that is in real life though once the reviews come out. I did see a review yesterday posted, and they were saying basically it was exactly the same dynamic range as the A7R II, but let's wait and see what happens when it's fully released, and we'll see the reviews, because naturally you'll get comparisons between the A7R II and the A7R III. So that'll be discussed once reviews come out. The electronic shutter is 10 frames per second with new Sony. Well, that's not with new Sony lenses. That's with everything. I just need to delete that because I copied and pasted this from the A9. So it is 10 frames per second. The mechanical shutter is also 10 frames per second. But I think you lose dynamic range once you go over 7. I think it then drops down to 12 bits against the 14-bit files. But it's 12-bit on the A7R, the A9, and I haven't had an issue with that either. I think it's perfect. Like I said, we've got zero blackout, only at 7 frames per second. If you go above that, there is a blackout. It's very small, but it is there, which could be a difference. Also, this is limited to 1/8000th of a second. Now, just to go back to this too, the electronic shutter, that's a big advantage. I wish they'd put that into the A9, because that sometimes if you're shooting flash and you're shooting very fast strobe work, like my Pro Photo units will keep up with 10 frames per second. That new A1 that I'm using, the Pro Photo, will also shoot at 10 frames per second. So I could use that, and it is disappointing that Sony didn't put that same shutter into the A9. But having said that, 90% of the time I'm not using the mechanical shutter on the A9. That's when I will go back to my A7R II. Usually when I'm using flash, I'll start to use a mechanical shutter. So there is a big advantage in being able to shoot 10 frames per second mechanical, particularly if you're using it for strobe work in studio. So this is where the A7R II will start to excel, and I'll summarise this as we go through at the end. Like I said, 1/8000th of a second. There is some rolling shutter, and that's been proven by a number of reviewers now that are showing the camera actually out there. You can see that there's some rolling shutter. And that has to be the case because it's not using that same sensor that the Sony A9 uses. If you look at all the literature that Sony have been promoting with the A9, they're always showing things like golfers with their club and their swinging. They're showing everything that you don't get that rolling shutter. That's not being shown for the A7R III because it's a different camera and it's not meant for that purpose. So you will get rolling shutter if you're doing very fast moving subjects. Sony have admitted in their literature that if you move the camera sideways very fast and things like that, that you will get rolling shutter. So that is going to be an issue if you are trying to not have rolling shutter at all. If you shoot generally though, and you know, shooting video normally and you're not panning around like crazy and stuff like that, it's not going to be an issue. But it would be an issue if you're shooting electronic shutter in sports, for instance. You would get that issue starting to appear if you were using the electronic shutter. So I'm going to go through questions and then I'm going to sum up. Oh, no, I might sum up first what I think first, actually, and then we'll come up. I'll go through the questions with you together just to make sure I cover everything. So for me, there's still no perfect camera, and for me personally, if I didn't have the A7R II, I would definitely be buying the A7R III to work with my A9. And the way that would work for me in a wedding, for instance, is that I'll be using the A9 for probably 80 to 85% of the time when I'm shooting weddings. Because for me, the perfect file size is that 24 megapixel file size. If you're shooting events and any of these type of wedding type scenarios, concerts, things like that, I don't need over 40 megapixels in file size. That is going to get ridiculous when you're dealing with those file sizes later on. 24 megapixels, I think, is the perfect file size. That's why I believe that if you're dealing with weddings, if you're dealing with events, if you're dealing with that type of work, the Sony A9 is the best camera in the world for that type of scenario. And that's the reason why I love the A9 so much. That 1/32,000th of a second exposure also is incredible. The 20 frames per second is also incredible. If you're dealing with studio work, if you're doing that type of work, if you're doing landscape, if you're doing that type of work where it's a bit slower, you need the resolution. Like I use all of my studio work usually is done with the A7R II because I like to do high-end retouching. That's always going to be with the A7R II, and now it would be with the A7R III. So if you're dealing with that aspect, the A7R III is the camera to get. And this is why I'm saying that you need multiple cameras to do the same job. You can't really have one camera to do everything, and I'm just trying to make sure people just don't think that you can use one camera for everything. You do need multiple cameras. That's why even if you didn't have the A9, you could use the A6500 to get those other features that the A7R II hasn't got. Video-wise, the A7R III is way ahead of what the A9 will give you at this stage. I think, to be honest, I still think that the full frame look of the A9 is still going to be better. The issue is, though, you've got no picture profiles on the A9, and that's the issue with that at the moment. You can't use any picture profiles. And if you need something with the full dynamic range, you need those picture profiles. They may give that to the A9 eventually, but it hasn't happened yet. So if you're dealing with video, you would definitely be getting the A7R III, because it is at this stage the best video camera that Sony have got at this point of time until the A7S III or whatever they bring out, the A9S comes out. So for me personally, I would honestly have both. Am I going to upgrade the A7R III? Not yet. A7R II? Not yet. I may next year sometime, but for me at this stage, I'm still happy with what the A7R II is giving me. And I've got the A9, I've got the A6300 and the A6500 if I need those cameras as well. I'm probably going to just hang off a little bit and just wait and see what they bring out with the A7S III or whatever that is, or even the A7 III. For me particularly, I'm waiting on 4K 60p to be released. After I've been using the GH5 for that, I do not want to lose that aspect of being able to shoot in weddings at 4K in 60p, so I can slow that down 50% and you get that beautiful cinematic look. So I'm waiting on Sony to release that, and that will probably come out in an A7S III or even an A6-700 or whatever that next camera is going to be. So that's personally what I'm waiting for at this stage. If I didn't have the A7R II, I would definitely be buying the A7R III. But I do have the A7R II. So for me, it's just not worth it at this stage to upgrade. So let's go over to questions too, because I'd love to see what you guys are saying about all this. So I'm going to go back and just see what people are saying. Let's have a look. Charles said, yeah, I'll give you 2 weeks after it comes out. I know, I said this about the A9. This is why you guys are all so cynical of me, because I said I'm not getting the A9 and I bought it on its release date here in Australia. Guys, come on, trust me. David, this will be an interesting topic. I wonder where this new Sony product will fail us. Looks so good so far, though. And look, it is. It's an amazing release, and I think they've answered everything that they needed to. Sony have answered the D850 easily with this release, and I think that's basically probably all that they wanted to do. I was thinking, wow, the D850 is such an amazing release, and it still is, the Nikon, but Sony have one-upped them on this. I mean, if the D850 had this electronic viewfinder and stabilization, well, they might have been more on par, but the Sony is now, I think it has leapfrogged that. So it's the best of that type of camera now that it's available. Like I said, for me, if I didn't have the A7R II, I would definitely be getting it. Stepping over from Canon, was wondering A9 or new A7R III for first Sony full-frame camera. And Neil, like I said, it depends on what your shooting is. If you're into weddings and events, that type of work, or doing dance concerts, anything like that where you need the maximum frames per second, the maximum shutter rate and things like that, you go for the A9. If you're more into landscape, if you're more into video, more into studio type work, you go for the A7R II. And that's why I'm saying I think you still need both at this stage. There's no perfect camera. It's mostly going to be down to what type of shooting you do, and only you know that. But for me personally, the A9 is still going to be my go-to camera. That is the best camera I've ever used, and I just adore it. That 1/32,000th of a second alone is enough for me to just never use another camera. I just adore that ability to shoot, if you're using natural light, 1/32,000th of a second outdoors at 1.4 is just amazing. Jim said, it would seem to me it depends on what type of photography. Yes, it does, Jim. Action photos. I think the A9 is the choice of the two. Portraiture landscape, A7R III it is, yes. Like I said, you're not going to beat that camera, particularly in landscape, the A7R III. You're also not going to beat it in a studio environment where you need to do high-end retouching. That's the area where the A7R III will be outstanding. And like I said, I still use my A7R II now. If dynamic range is really important, like for me, for instance, if I knew I had to really underexpose and raise the shadows up, I would be using the A7R II because I know it's a stop better than what the A9 is. But you'd be amazed at how much you can lift the A9 as well. It's still a really usable camera in dynamic range. They're way better than anything you had a couple of years ago. What else have we got? Jim said you will need new computing power to handle the A7R III RAWs. Well, I mean, mine handles it fine, Jim. The A7R II, and they're the same file size. The difference is if you were firing off multiple shots of this, if you're using the A7R III at 10 frames per second, the amount of gigabytes you're going to put in storage is going to be incredible. This is why I'm saying if you're shooting mostly events, weddings type work, you need to be using the A9. Now, you also can use the camera, the A7R III in APS-C mode, but the problem is then you lose your wide-angle lenses. And this is the issue with using it in APS-C, because remember, you then have to use that crop factor of 1.5, so that becomes an issue. If you do want that full frame look, you have to be shooting it in full frame. That's why I think the 24 megapixel file size is the go-to camera for events and weddings. And this is why I can't understand why Sony don't also promote the Sony A9 as the best wedding camera. They shouldn't just be saying sports camera, because I do think that is the best wedding camera on earth at the moment. What else have we got here? Mike said, David, seriously, 76 RAWs is 7.6 seconds on the A7R II. I can't imagine the situation where you'd need more. And you're probably right, Mike, too. You probably wouldn't. Like I said, it's probably only in some sports. I know sports photographers will run out their actual... they will run out their buffer. So some sports shooters will really fire it out. Neil said, not so much for sports, mainly landscape, portrait, just starting out for weddings. Yeah, so like I said, if you're intending, Neil, to go more into weddings, I would definitely get the A9. If you're intending to do more portraits and landscape, you would go for the A7R III. And this is why I'm saying it's so hard to choose a camera that's perfect for all. There just isn't a camera out there that's perfect for all. What else we got? Jim said, in my opinion, does not exclude the A9 from great portraits and landscape shots, just less detail. Yeah, it doesn't, but to be honest, if I'm shooting landscape, I'm using my A7R II. So I just want that resolution there. Remember, resolution is king if you're dealing with landscape, because remember, you only have so many pixels that you're dealing with, and pixels create detail. So if you're looking at a landscape picture and you're looking at a tree with leaves, the more detail, the more pixels that you've got in those leaves, the more detail you have. And that's like when I showed that bee photo, where when I enlarged it up, you could see the bee and you could see the bee's individual stripes, and you could hardly even see that bee in the initial file. So clearly, definitely if you're doing landscape, I would be using the 42. You can't beat the A7R II or a high megapixel camera for landscape. Royce said, I'm mainly into travel and street photography. I'm not into sport or into movies, and I like a lighter camera. What is best for me? Do you think the Sony will produce, say, an A7 III? Yeah, they will. It's just they have to. They have to bring out a camera that is going to be around about that $2,000 mark. So it's just a matter of waiting, Roy. It's going to happen. We just don't know when. But to be honest, if you were just doing street photography, I'd be getting something like the A6500 now at this stage, or waiting for the A7 III to come out, because both of these cameras are probably over what you need for just doing street photography. I don't think you need an A7R III or the A9 for doing street photography. I'd be quite happy with the A6500 and then wait to see what they release for something like the A7 III or something like that as a new camera coming in later on. Neil said, my only thought is, I know you need a camera like the A7R III for the detail on some of the portraits. Is that possible to get with the A9 because I cannot afford both? Look, the detail that you're getting with the A9 is incredible, and it is really an amazing camera. If you only had the A9, you're still going to get amazing results. You've just got to look at it from the fact that if you can only afford, I can tell you which one I'd buy. If I could only afford one camera, I would buy the A9. That's me personally. If I could only have one, I would buy the A9. But that's the way that I shoot mostly. But even if I didn't shoot that way, if I can only have one camera, I would still get the A9. Because for me, that 24 megapixel is the perfect size that I like to have for all of my images. It gives you enough that you can crop, and it doesn't take up too much resources on your computer as well. Like if you've done a wedding, you know, you're not going to have 100 gigabytes in file size just for doing a wedding on 24 megapixels. So for me, that's ample. And I've found the A9 easily has enough dynamic range for what I need. And it works fantastic, and I love that 20 frames per second, and I love that 1/32,000th of a second shutter speed, which I would not want to lose. Like I've heard some people saying they might sell their A9s for the A7R III. I would never do that, ever. I would buy an A7R III first, but even then I'm going to keep my A7R II. I don't think I'm going to sell that because it's got the Play Memories apps in it, which I use as well. I love the fact that I can have the no time limit on my A7R II. So I don't think I'm going to be selling that camera. I think I'll keep it, even if I do get the A7R III. But if I could only buy one camera, personally, I would get the A9. But remember, everyone is different. What have we got here? Neil said, price point, I would go with the A7R III. Yeah, it is cheaper. I mean, that's the thing. You've got to have enough money to justify the A9. Altric said, hey, David, I have to watch this later. I'm shooting a wedding. No worries, Altric. It'll be straight online after this. Jim said, Mike, in my opinion, any digital sensor will have rolling shutter to a varying degree. I think ultimate fix requires 2 or more processors to read the sensor, yet frames per second will challenge any number of CPUs. Yeah, I've seen very little rolling shutter in the A9 though, Jim. Very little rolling shutter. I haven't even noticed it, to be honest. Mike said, true, I just wanted to inform David about the issue. Jim said, I wish Sony would come out with a stacked 32 megapixel sensor. They may in the future. Neil said next year is only a couple of months away, and it's not far off. I don't think we're going to see another announcement from Sony this year now, though. I think it's probably going to be spring in America next year. So probably early in the year, they might really announce an A9. They're obviously having issues with the A9S, because I think that would have already been announced, and they're probably trying to work out how they can get the 4K 60p and a larger megabit file size. They have to compete with the GH5 in that respect, because the GH5 will give you 400 megabits, and it's also 4K 60p. So they have to compete with that. So I think that Sony are making sure that they get that camera right before they announce that camera. It'll come. We've just got to wait. Casper said the A9 is way better. Depends on what you shoot, Casper, but it certainly is for me. Nick and I said, why have everyone stopped talking about the A7 III? It's going to come, Nick and I. It's just a matter of waiting. It's only a matter of time before that camera is announced. Like I said, Sony have to bring out a camera that can compete with the lower end cameras around that $2,000 mark. So it will come out, and hopefully it'll have a lot of the features that the A7R III has, like the dual card slots, things like that. We're hoping that all those things flow down. Usually Sony are very good in the fact that they flow things down to their lower-ended cameras. So, you know, and I also think it's only a matter of time, too, before we see an A6700, so, or an A7000. I'm not sure what the next one will be, but it's only a matter of time before that's announced as well. I'm rapt they keep announcing things. I mean, you hear a lot of people whinging, and first thing that Canon and all these people do is whinge about how many cameras Sony release. I think it's a great thing. You don't have to buy those cameras if you don't want to, the latest release. But at least if you do want to, you're getting new features, and I think bring it on. That's personally the way I think. Jim said, from David's A9 overheating video in early 2017... You need to watch that. I had a bit of fun with that video. If you need to fry eggs or heat food on your bum or shoot the A9, it's as a go-to camera. I love it. What else? Andrew said, what's the lowest price do you think the A7R II will go? Maybe Black Friday would be a perfect time to catch a deal. And it may be, look, at the moment I believe you can get it some places for around about $1,800, I think. So it's going to probably, Black Friday may be around that figure. You would have to think by Christmas it's going to be standard around about 1,800, which means, you know, your second-hand prices are going to be probably $1,500, $1,600 the way that they're going down at the moment. As soon as the A7R is released, there's going to be a glut of the A7R II in the marketplace. And if you can get that camera for a really good deal, it's a fantastic camera. I love my A7R II. So, you know, and I don't have any issue using that camera still. Like I said, basically it's almost the same sensor that's in the new camera. It's just you've got these other features like the better video and the better focus, things like that. But like I said, for me personally, I'm only using the A7R II for around about 15% of my shoots now. So for me, that's not an issue and I can put up with that. Like I said, if I was shooting more landscape and more just straight on studio portrait type work, I probably would have upgraded to the A7R III immediately, but for me at this stage it's just not worth it. That's why I'm hanging out to see what Sony release a little bit further down the line. But yeah, I mean, I think if you can get a cheap A7R II now, and that's all the money that you have, that's an amazing camera to get if you could pick that up for, say, $1,800. It's an amazing camera. So yeah, keep a look at it. If you're sort of thinking, well, I've only got $2,000 to spend maximum, you may want to sort of wait and see how the A7R II will compare to, say, something that's released for the A7 III that may come out early next year sometime, for instance. So it's exciting times ahead to see what actually Sony do and what's released in the coming months. But so they're the things that I wanted to talk to you guys about, because I'm sort of thinking at the moment, I have had a hell of a lot of questions now flowing into me, and I thought the best way of addressing this is to put a video up talking about where I think they both fit. I think they have to work together in tandem, to be honest. If you're running this as a business, I do think you need both of them, if you can afford it, obviously, because I think both cameras have a totally different area to shoot. The A9 for sort of high movement, better file size in the fact that for working for weddings, things like that. The ISO clearly is going to be is better in the A9. I mean, it goes up to 209,000, 204,000 as against 100-odd thousand on the A7R II. But I think if you downsampled it, it probably would end up almost the same anyway if you went down to the same file size. Focusing is probably going to be a little bit better in the A9, but that's natural. You're paying for that in the fact that it's the sports camera. But if you're dealing with things like better video, better landscape camera, the A7R III is the way to go. Andrew said, I'll be good with the A6500 and the A7R III at a good deal. And yeah, that's the thing. That's what you might want to do, Andrew, is to be using those two cameras for cheaper than what you could buy the A7R III for instance. Could be a good way of doing it. Or if you can afford it. Look, if you can afford it and all you can afford is the A7R III, I wouldn't hesitate about getting it, because that is still going to be a great overall camera. If that's the only one you could afford, it's fantastic. And to be honest, I don't think at the moment, I probably wouldn't buy an A6500 and A7R II. I would probably get the A7R III if that was me at that case. I would just get the A7R III and call that a day if you can only afford that one camera. But obviously, like I said, if you can afford more and you are doing more weddings and events, I'd be getting the A9 if you can afford it. Jim said, I have both the A7 II and the A6500 and love how they perform. They're still great cameras, Jim. BMCP said, will Canon and Nikon react to the A7R III by reducing their prices on comparable camera bodies? Probably not. I don't think that they will. And I'm surprised that Sony brought that camera in at the price they did. I think that's a great buy for what you're getting. The A7R III to undercut the Nikon D850 was a great marketing move by Sony. And I think they're going to sell like hotcakes, these things. It's a great price. Like I've heard some people saying it's expensive. That's not expensive at all for the camera you're getting. Charles said the price difference is not that much from A7R II to A7 III. It's $400. A7R II is $900 on sale US version. A7R III is a great deal for what you get, and surprised they didn't raise the price. And I agree with you, Charles, that it is a really good price for the technology you're getting inside that camera. Like I said, I thought that there would be more than $400 difference though. If that's all that there is difference, I'd be getting the A7R III if you didn't have it. Like I said, for me it's a bit different. I've already got the A7R II, so I don't feel the need to jump up yet. But if you didn't have the A7R II and you could afford the A7R III, I would jump up to the A7R III without hesitation at all, because it's going to be an incredible camera. That's basically it. Now, like I said too, guys, if you can, please give me a thumbs up too. I'd love to sort of get this around YouTube a bit more. Also, like I said, if you're not on the live chat, leave any questions you've got down below, because I'd love to know what your opinion about all this is. It's a hard decision, I know, and this is what Sony are really good at doing this. It's a hard decision if you can only afford one camera. Which one would you go for? Like I said, personally for me, and if I could only buy one camera, I would buy the A9, but that's the way that I shoot. Like I said, if you're a landscape shooter, if you're just doing portraits, I would be probably getting the A7R II if you're working a bit slower. But if you're doing stuff like I'm doing, which is a lot of weddings, a lot of event type work, fair bit of also portraits, and also, well, I don't do much landscapes, only when I travel. But so for me, the A9 is definitely the go-to camera for me. And I would use the A7R II a lot less, or A7R III a lot less, but I'm lucky I've also got the A7R II, so that's the reason why at this stage I'm not upgrading. My shooting at the moment just doesn't justify it. So is there any last questions, guys, before we go? Otherwise, I'll have a couple more videos up this week of live shoots that I've done. I want to show you a few more things. I've got some really exciting stuff that I'm going to show you. I discussed in my last live view about my Sony A9. It's been sent off to repair. I had an issue with it that it's now being fixed. Amazing service from Sony Pro Support. I'll find out what that problem is early this week coming, and if it's going to take longer than 3 days to fix, they're going to send me out a loan camera. So what a great service it is as well. So hopefully I'm missing that camera like crazy, and I've got a massive shoot coming this weekend, so I definitely need something this weekend to get around it, so they'll have something for me this weekend. Sid said, David, are you getting the A7R III for your first full-frame camera? Oh, if you are getting the A7R III for your first full-frame camera, what would you recommend as a first full-frame lens? Well, I think if you can afford it, for me personally, the first full-frame lens I would get, I'm really into shooting primes. I'd get the Sony 35 1.4. That's what I would get if I only could afford one lens to get. So that's me personally. The second lens that I would get is the Zeiss Batis or the Sony 1.8 85mm, because I love that 85mm focal length. I don't shoot much zooms anymore. I'm really into prime lenses at the moment. The most way I shoot now is to use the 35 1.4 Sony lens, and I use the 85 Batis. You could replace that with the Sony Batis, Sony 85 1.8, sorry. And I also use the Sony 55 1.8 because that's the fastest focusing lens that Sony have. If you're dealing with low light scenarios, the 55 1.8 is incredible. And that's by far the fastest lens for focusing in low light conditions that I've found. So I also always take that with me as well. But if you could only afford one lens, definitely for me, I love the 35mm focal length. It would be the Sony 35mm focal length 1.4 I would have. Someone's asking where they saw the A7R II price from. Neil, no beers today. I'm going to have one in a minute, actually. It's really hot out there today. It's 28 degrees Celsius, Neil. So it's a lovely day outside, so I'm going to go and have a beer. We call it beer o'clock. I'm going to have a beer o'clock in a few minutes, actually. Jim said, thanks, high fives for Ken, hugs for Susie. Always great to hear from you, mate. Yeah, Ken's sitting back there. I must find Susie. She's dumped me. I don't know where she's gone. Where else have we got? Risa said, this morning I was at the Sony Centre. They said Sony A7R III is going to be $5,000. Are you talking about the Oh, is that in Australia? The A7R III is only, it's not that much, Reza. I'm not sure where you're getting that price from. Charles said, do you think the price is a lead to buying their expensive lenses? Not sure what that means, Charles. I don't think Sony lenses are that expensive, and this is what a lot of people say. You've got to remember that the price of the Nikon and Canon lenses when they were released early on were similar if you look at the prices when they were released. But also, what you've got to remember too is the G Master lenses particularly are future-proofed. The Canon and Nikon lenses aren't future-proofed. In fact, the G Master lenses are rated at 100 megapixel file sizes. They will resolve 100 megapixel. The Sony and Canon lenses won't do that. So, if you're dealing with Sony lenses, they are future-proofing their lenses, and they are incredibly sharp. If you look at the ratings for these lenses, they're much sharper than what you'll get for the Nikon and Canon equivalent. So I don't think they are that expensive, guys, and I think, you know, we shouldn't really say that they are that expensive, really. You get what you pay for. And you've got to remember, too, I'm not paid by Sony to say this. I'm not sponsored by absolutely anyone, so no one can have a go at me to say, oh, you're a Sony sponsored whatever. I'm not sponsored by anyone, so I'm just telling you the truth the way I see it. Yeah, I've got no sponsors at all. Jim said Susie's in rehab, too much Corona. Perhaps that's the case. I might give Ken a Corona once I'm finished here, Jim. We might throw a beer to him. I should have brought one in. I'm going to have one in a minute. It's that hot today. I can't wait to have a beer o'clock this afternoon. Yeah, so let me know, like I said, let me know in the comments down below what you think about this. You know, are you going to buy the A7R II? Are you still confused about whether you need the A7R III or the A7R II or buy the A9? Because I'd love to know what you're thinking as well. And obviously, if you're a wedding and wedding and events photographer, let me know if you think that. I'm laughing at some of these comments. Let me know what you think about if you think you'd love to have the A9 if you haven't got that camera. But like I said, for me, that camera has been a game changer for me. I just adore that camera for the way that I shoot, and it's just incredible. Drowning her sorrows, Ken dumped her. I love you guys. It just cracks me up. So, any last questions, guys, before we finish for the day? Oh, Modelo, yeah. I don't even know if you can get that here, Jim. I'll have to have a look. What nationality is that beer? Where does that beer come from? I do love trying, and I discussed this in the other live video we had, I do love trying other local beers. Whenever I travel to other countries, I always try the local beers. I love it. All right, guys, I'm going to head off. I think it's beer o'clock for me. And I'll see you all again soon for the next videos. Like I said, leave some questions down below if you want me to answer any of those. And stay tuned for some more videos of behind-the-scene work. And please remember to join the Facebook page because I've got stacks of behind-the-scenes happening there as well. So that's it, guys. Cheers, because I'm going to go and have a beer. Catch you soon. Bye.